In this video, I'm just going to look at my experience at the Jacksonville Marathon that I ran last week. And because it didn't go exactly how I wanted, this is just kind of like a race recap so I can kind of talk to myself, so perhaps I can learn something for my next race. So before we get into it, the Jacksonville Marathon was going to be an A race for me. This is the race that I wanted to do really well at. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you know that I was registered for the Boston Marathon in October of 2021. But of course, I injured myself, you remember that. I twisted my ankle while out for a long run. That laid me up for a little bit and I couldn't go to Boston. So I needed something to focus on. And the Jacksonville Marathon fell at just the right time, where it gave me enough time to recover and it gave me enough time to build up my training. You might also remember that I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to run a marathon. So 2 weeks before the Jacksonville Marathon, I ran the cross-country marathon. And that was a way for me to get in my last long run. But we'll get more into that and how I feel about running that race in just a minute. Now, of course, hindsight is always 20/20, but you know what? This actually follows up from my race video. So if you haven't already seen my race video, why don't you press pause on this? Go and watch the race video. But ultimately, I arrived in Jacksonville the day before the race, went to the shops, got some bananas, and I did have a strategy. I did have a fueling strategy. So I started off my morning, race morning, with 2 bananas covered in peanut butter. I figured that was enough to get everything moving. Also a couple cups of coffee, but nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't do anything pre-Jacksonville Marathon that I haven't done on other marathons, on other training runs. I also knew that I was going to be fueling with this Spring Energy Awesome Source gels. Each one is 180 calories. I had planned to take 4 on my run. I have trained with this gel, I have run races with this gel, and everything has worked out great in the past. Of course, if you've seen my race video, you know that I was wearing 2 watches. I was wearing the Garmin Fenix 5X and the Polar Grit X Pro. Wasn't taking any chances. I was also wearing the Polar H10 chest strap, just so my heart rate was dialed in. Didn't want to take any chances with these optical heart rate sensors dropping out. When you're running a marathon and you're on that line, and you know that if you go over the line, you can get into trouble. You want your heart rate to be spot on. That's why I was wearing the chest heart rate monitor for this race. So just before I start going into the gun, the start, the middle, the end of the race, I want you guys to know this isn't my first marathon. Even though some of the mistakes I made, you would be forgiven for thinking this is my first marathon. The Jacksonville Marathon was actually my 44th marathon. I've also run 8 ultra marathons, so I've got experience in long distance racing. But I think the lesson here is that sometimes we can make some poor decisions, and that's okay. We just have to own these decisions and understand that the result is just a culmination of our decisions. Saying that, there are a lot of factors that maybe went into how I performed that day, and there are a lot of confounding variables, so I don't think we can point to exactly one reason why things went sideways for me in the race. So let's get started with the beginning of the race, because it was very warm. The 5K and the half marathon all started with the marathon, so there was a lot of people at the start. And when the gun went off and I started running, I felt pretty good. I felt pretty good in the way that I thought I was holding back. It felt like I could run a lot faster. Now, for those of you that maybe haven't run a marathon, or you've only run a few, that's a normal feeling. When you've tapered a little bit, you are supposed to be going into a marathon feeling fantastic. And those first couple miles, it is a real challenge to keep that pace under control, because you feel like you can just run so much faster. So it felt good that I was holding back. I was like, man, you are strategizing well, Matt. Now, as you already know, I was wearing 2 watches. Now, from the beginning, I decided to only look at the Garmin Fenix 5X. I was wearing that on my right wrist. I was wearing the Polar Grit X Pro on my left wrist. And if anyone's interested, I also had the Stride Pod on my left shoe. So I am just gathering data all over on this race. But instead of going back and forth between the watches, I just made a decision. I'm gonna check the Garmin this time. And because I had raised my goal to a 7:03 minute mile, I knew kind of the pace that I wanted to run in the beginning, and it was gonna be right around 7:03. If I was a couple of seconds over, fine. If I was a couple of seconds under, also fine. But the Garmin recorded for my first couple of miles a 7:01, a 7, a 7:04, a 6:57, a 6:59, and a 7:08. Pretty good. Like, I was happy with that. Even when I saw the 6:57 split, it was only a couple of seconds under my goal pace. I knew that with excitement, maybe it was a part of the course that was just slightly downhill. That was okay. I wasn't blowing myself up. But after a couple of miles, I looked at the Polar and I started noticing there was a big discrepancy between what the Polar was telling me and what the Garmin was telling me. So the Polar was reading for the same first 6 miles. Now that's a a big difference. Now, there is a big difference between those mile splits. You know, sometimes it's only as low as 9 seconds, other times it's up to 17 seconds different. Now, when you're starting a marathon, that's a big deal. Running 17 seconds faster than your goal pace, that is gonna come back to bite you. And after the first couple miles, I realized something's going on. What is right? Now, if you saw the video, you saw that I was calling out my 5-mile splits each time. I've just crossed the 10-mile mark in 1 hour, 10 minutes, and 40 seconds. When I called out the 5-mile splits, I was calling them out from the Garmin. So that's probably not exactly correct, just because in hindsight, now that I finished the race, I can find out that the Garmin was a little short. Now, the Jacksonville Marathon is a measured course. It has a number from USA Track and Field Measurement. Whoever it is that measures these courses to make them official, the Jacksonville Marathon has their measurements in place. So we know it is an exact course. Saying that, at the end of the marathon, I stopped the watch on the Garmin and it said 25.88 miles. Polar measured 26.63 miles. Now look, I hate it when people complain about GPS inaccuracies because ultimately these things on our wrists, they're talking to satellites in outer space. It is very rare that we are going to run the exact course that was measured. If we are running next to people, someone is going to take the tightest line. The person running next to them is going to be taking a little longer line. And when you add that up over the course of 42.2 kilometers, those differences can be great. I really think the 26.63 miles that the Polar Grit X Pro measured is pretty accurate. There are always going to be GPS anomalies, GPS inaccuracies, and we kind of have to take that with a pinch of salt. I was more than happy to take the Polar's data at 26.63 miles. That to me just seemed the most accurate. So right now you're looking at my race analysis from Strava, and actually looking at this actually doesn't look like a horrible race. It looks fairly even. I'm not sure about the scale because it was not that even, but here the differences in my pacing, they don't look too bad. I'm actually pretty pleased with the race looking at that. Clearly there is a decline as the race went on. And then you see mile 26, that was when I had some GI issues that made me actually stop and walk. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself because I first noticed that perhaps the race wasn't going as well as I expected fairly early on. In fact, it was when I noticed that the Polar watch was showing me considerably faster splits than the Garmin that I thought, wait a second, maybe I am running a little fast. All of a sudden, around mile 4, 5, 6, things weren't feeling as well as I thought they should at that stage of the race. But what can you do? At that point, I am well and truly invested. I couldn't go back and run them slower. So from about mile 5 to mile 10, I purposely slowed down. I tried to slow my roll just a little bit, and that started working out pretty well. But by then, unfortunately, I have to say the damage was already done. I was going to be struggling because I ran too fast in those first couple of miles. And you know the old adage, I think it's the 6 P's, proper pacing prevents piss poor performance. And that adage rang pretty much true for me on this day. So let me show you the race analysis one more time. Mile 20 is kind of where things started to shift. Let me back up to mile 16 because on this race analysis, you can see that there are a couple of miles that are just slightly faster. That's when I met my buddy Brian. He was from Sarasota. He had driven up for this race as well, and he came up behind me and I was able to run with him for a few miles. He was going for the same goal as me, a 3:05, and things were feeling good for a couple of miles. I was able to pick up my turnover, and although it didn't feel sustainable, it felt okay. I was okay running with him, but inevitably that pace caught up with me and I slowed down just a little bit. Now, by this point, it is starting to rain. It is still incredibly humid. Although the rain felt really good, by this point, my legs were shot. It was very difficult just getting them to turn over at a fast enough cadence. But then you can see at mile 24, it started to slow down considerably. And that's when I started noticing a lot of pain in the very lower part of my belly. Now, it wasn't anything that I thought I was gonna have to stop. Of course, it's running through my mind, oh, Matt, you're gonna have to stop and go to the loo. You're gonna lose time. We're gonna keep an eye on this and see how it progresses. At this point, I had 3 gels. And as I've already said, I have practiced with these gels. I have used them in past races. In the past, I've run a lot of marathons and I have had gels that have been fine for 10 marathons, and then all of a sudden, I think the gel upset my stomach just a little bit. And I think that is what happened this time. It's really impossible to tell because if you saw my pre-race video, you saw I went to the shops and I picked up some bananas for my dinner before the race, and the bananas looked a bit dodgy. These bananas are looking a bit sketchy, but seeing as I'm going to eat them all by tomorrow, I think these will do. Perhaps It was the dodgy bananas that finally got to me and gave me that stomach pain. And that's what I mean about confounding variables. There were a couple of things that were just a little off in hindsight that could have caused this discomfort. So eventually, mile 25 rolls around, you can see my pace slows down considerably again. Things were getting pretty dire. So eventually it got to be too much and I had to walk. After a few minutes, I came upon an aid station and I had a lot more to drink. And then I started feeling better. And obviously better enough that I was able to start running again. And you can see for the last little bit, the pace did pick up. I didn't take away from my legs feeling tired, but I didn't have that stomach pain. And without that stomach pain, I was actually feeling pretty good. Now, up until the point when I slowed down, I was still on target to run a sub 3:10. I had it all mapped out in my head. I wasn't running too hard that I couldn't do math. I was looking at my splits and figuring out, okay, yeah, Matt, you're still going to come in under a 3:10. Then that stomach pain happened and I had to walk, and that's what caused me to come in just a couple minutes over my B goal of 3:10. And I finished the race in 3:12:21. Now I've had time to talk to people, look back on the race, see maybe some things that I could have done better, maybe some things that I definitely should have done better, and things that I will change for the future. Let's just start off with the fueling. As I've already said, I have practiced with these in training. I have raced with these. I am not going to change from these gels in the future just because I had a reaction in the same kind of time frame that I was taking them. I honestly don't think it was the gels. After speaking to my wife, she was telling me that dehydration could have played a big role in how I was feeling, which is totally legit. It was fairly warm and very, very humid, and I was sweating a lot more than I was actually taking in. And the case in point is when I stopped right before the end, like at mile 25, I was drinking left and right. And I felt 100 times better when I left the aid station than when I came into it with that stomach pain. Perhaps I need to drink a little more, especially on warm races. But you know how it goes. You're deep into the race, your legs are turning over. There were some aid stations that were a little too busy, some aid stations where I looked down and I saw that my heart rate was a little high, and I knew that if I took a drink, it was going to spike my heart rate, and anyway, I wasn't really thirsty. So these are all strategic things that I'm going to have to address moving forward. But here's the real thing. Here's the real thing that I needed my wife to point out to me, and I'm sure many of you have noticed the same thing, even though nobody has actually said it to me. But if this Jacksonville Marathon, if this was my goal race, then perhaps I should have gone into it a little more seriously. And by going into it more seriously, I mean taking my training a little more seriously and taking my taper a little more seriously. So ultimately, if I want to run a good marathon, I shouldn't run a marathon 2 weeks before. Also, I don't know how close you follow me on Strava, but I post most of my activities on Strava. I don't post everything. So if you think I'm doing too much on Strava, I'm definitely doing too much, because there's a lot of stuff that I keep it just for me to see. I don't want to blow up everyone's Strava feed with all the activities that I do. So I did continue to ride the Peloton in the 2 weeks leading up to the race. And I was also going to the gym, and I was doing weights, and I was on the elliptical doing my cross training up until a couple of days before the race. Perhaps I did overdo it a little bit, and perhaps that contributed to me feeling tired a little earlier in the race than I ordinarily would have. Who knows? These are some of the confounding variables that they kind of shed light on everything when we look at it from a whole, but it's hard to say exactly what it is. Now, in the past, I followed this same recipe and I've had great success. But of course, in the past, I was a lot younger than I am right now. As far as future marathon plans, at this moment, I don't know. You know, I'm running the Boston Marathon. That's not until April. It has crossed my mind to register for the Celebration Marathon, but that is a work weekend, so I'd have to take a day off work. I don't know. Stay tuned to the channel, because I'll keep you posted on things I'm working towards in the future. Guys, if you have any questions or comments, I'd certainly welcome them. And if you have stayed all the way to the end of this video of just me rabbiting on about my race, thank you for your time. Be kind, be happy, run well. See you in a couple of days.